Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokemon TCG Pocket metagame and hopefully inform you guys on exactly what's going on from a competitive perspective in all of these online Pokemon TCG Pocket tournaments. Today we're taking a look at the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly number 16, or of course Ursa Days is always the largest weekly Pokemon TCG Pocket tournament. This week we had about 1,800 players competing, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about, so let's get right into it. First thing we're going to do is talk about the standings here and the final results. This is the final standings, basically, where everybody placed in the tournaments here, and as you can see, Charizard ended up winning this week. I'm not going to toot my own horn, but I've been talking about Charizard for a while now. A lot of people disrespect Charizard because, again, it doesn't seem like a great deck at first glance. It's not super consistent. It doesn't have the best matchup spreads in the world, but, you know, this was a heavy Exeggutor format. Last week, we saw Exeggutor win, whether it was with Yanmega or with Celebi. The Celebi version, by far the most popular now, but also Mew EX can get thrown in there as well. We'll talk a little bit about the metagame overall after we take a look at the standings and all of the decks, but yes, Charizard did win this week. I've been kind of guessing that this would happen, honestly. I think every single format up to now, Charizard ends up winning. I believe so far of the Space-time Smackdown format, we had Gyarados win week 1, and then we had Exeggutor win week 2, and now we have Charizard winning here week 3. This is really kind of makes sense to me. Charizard's kind of up in play. Exeggutor has gone up in play. That is a favorable matchup for Charizard. But in general, I think whenever a lot of people play Charizard, whenever it sees a lot of play, this week it was actually the second most played deck. Chances are enough people playing Charizard are going to, get lucky, right? They're going to draw into the right cards. They're going to just sort of, roll their opponents. Charizard by far the most high roll deck, the most highest potential deck. The overall strongest deck in Pokemon Pocket, even though not the most consistent. But, oftentimes when you're trying to win tournaments, right, we're not playing like on the ladder, we're not playing an emblem event, we're not trying to have the highest average win rate. What we're trying to do when you're playing in tournaments is win, right? And the best deck oftentimes to win are the decks that have either the best matchup spreads for that particular metagame or just the overall strongest, highest potential deck. That's what we see with Charizard and why it's one of the most winning decks in all of Pokemon TCG Pocket. But let's go ahead and take a look at this Charizard list here. Nothing is super surprising. Charizard has been somewhat figured out. However, there are some things here that are a little bit different than what we have typically seen. So I think for the last couple weeks, we've seen Charizard playing things like potions, and not necessarily playing a lot of tool cards. If we were playing tool cards, we were playing Giant Cape because it does put Moltres out of range of a lot of KOs at 140, brings us to 160. That's definitely a really good number. Moltres is not weak to fire, so Palkia, we're safe from getting KO'd. And just in general, basically nothing is one-hit KOing Moltres, especially not on turn 2 or turn 3. Very unlikely that Moltres gets KO'd, so it's really good to have Giant Cape on the Moltres here. No potions in this Charizard list. We have seen potion in most Charizard decks here. If you're not up to date with my previous meta reports or anything like that, Pokemon Communications is perhaps the biggest inclusion for Charizard this format. It's a big reason why we're only running 8 Pokemon in the deck. Very simple: 2 Moltres, 2 Charmander, 2 Charmeleon, and 2 Charizard. It's better to run Charizard this way with Pokemon Communications because it makes things a lot more consistent in our ability to find those evolution Pokemon. Just how Pokemon Communications works, I've talked about it previously, but in general, better to run less Pokemon now in most of your decks. And here we actually see 1 Dawn and 1 Leaf. These are inclusions that I actually really like. 1 Sabrina is interesting as well. I'm not exactly sure if Sabrina is it's probably better than Cyrus in this deck, to be fair, because most of the time we're not really looking to attack with Moltres and then bring something back up and KO it with Charizard. Really, Moltres is in the active spot to enable Charizard. Hopefully we draw into it, and then we just attack with Crimson Storm twice. Sabrina is going to allow us to maybe move one of those single prize Pokemon to the bench and bring up an EX Pokemon to take multiple prize cards, especially on our second KO if our opponent, maybe has 2 single prize Pokemon and then 1 EX Pokemon in play. We can KO one of those single prize Pokemon and then play Sabrina to move up that EX Pokemon and win the game there, taking 3 prizes. I do like Dawn as well. Gives us some flexibility. When we play X Speed and we retreat Moltres to the bench, we can bring up one of those fire energies from Moltres or any of our bench Pokemon, I suppose, most likely Moltres, onto Charizard, more consistently being able to get that second Crimson Storm attack off, and then Leaf as well, just allowing us to retreat a little bit more freely. So I actually really like this Charizard list, and like I said, I think Charizard by far has the highest potential. We've talked about this before. Like, again, you can categorize decks differently about, what's the best deck to play. Matchup spreads are a really important thing. We always cover the matchup spreads, which we'll do in a little bit later in this video. But overall win rate and consistency, Charizard is always low on the win rate, but it always finds its way really high, placing in basically every tournament that it's in. And no surprise to me that it ended up winning. We'll take a look again at all of the matchups and in the data spreads and things like that. But yeah, for this week, Charizard winning, and not honestly something I'm really surprised about. I've been talking about Charizard for a while now. I know people are going to say like, hey, maybe you got lucky this week, but that's exactly how Charizard works, right? It's just the thing is when Charizard gets lucky, it's a little bit more impactful than when any other deck gets lucky. So, plus a lot of more people were playing Charizard this week because of the high Exeggutor, so it does make sense. But what's interesting is that we still had a lot of Magnezone this week. I expected Magnezone to go down a little bit in play. Most Magnezone decks aren't good against Exeggutor, particularly the ones like the Fighting variant or the Darkrai variant. Magnezone is a really good card, but again, Water is seeing a pretty big decline. Magnezone is a strong card, again, against the Charizard decks because of Moltres, but overall, I figured we would see less Moltres this week. In fact, we actually saw, I think, maybe an increase of overall Magnezone, rather, this week, which is kind of interesting. But instead of maybe everyone playing Darkrai Magnezone, what we saw oftentimes was people playing Skarmory Magnezone, which did end up making it to the finals. And in fact, I'm a little bit surprised here that it made it all the way to the finals. But when you take a look at how much Exeggutor made it high up here, it's really not that big of a surprise. This has a pretty decent matchup against Exeggutor, while also having a strong matchup against those water type decks. And yes, we are playing Heatran. I know a lot of people commented on the videos, why are we playing Heatran? I don't necessarily know. When I play this deck, I don't play Heatran. I know it can be really good. I know we don't have a way to retreat out, so when you start off with Heatran, it can feel pretty bad, but the chances are it's 1 out of our 5 Pokemon. It's not super likely that we're going to be leading off with Heatran, but it does give us a secondary attack option there. 120 HP, not many things are KOing us, but also hitting for 110 damage. It's just another option. It's a little bit easier to have, one Skarmory and then go into your Magnezone and then go into your Heatran than to have like Skarmory and then 2 Magnezones. And that's obviously more ideal than going like Skarmory into Magnezone, because Skarmory only does 50 HP. So we want that Magnezone to get set up early, and when we're playing Heatran, after we commit that first energy, that metal energy to Skarmory, what we can do is start committing those energies to Heatran and then have maybe another Pokemon that can do 110 damage along with Magnezone, so that we're not just going, 2 Skarmories and then into a Magnezone. Oftentimes that's not enough damage to win games, especially against Exeggutor. So I do like Heatran in the Exeggutor matchup, even though it's making the deck a little bit less consistent off the jump, because again, we don't want to start with Heatran and we don't want to start with Magnemite either. So it is what it is. Still a decent amount of Pokemon in this deck, 9 Pokemon total. No Pokemon communications here, which is a little bit interesting, but we are playing 2 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, and then the Giant Cape Rocky Helmet again to enable Skarmory's Metal Arms attack. This is a really good deck. We'll take a look at the matchups for this deck in particular, but I think it was really well positioned. I've put this deck in the S tier in last week's tier list, and I talked about it, I think, as my 3rd or 2nd most highest on my list of decks to play going into this week. I just thought it had a really good matchup spread against a lot of the counter picks that people were going to be playing against Exeggutor, while also having a decent Exeggutor matchup in its own right, with Skarmory being able to one-hit KO executes before they evolve. Definitely a really prominent strategy here. No surprise to me. Now, if we look at again, in a little bit, we'll take a look at how many people were playing these decks and we'll contrast them to their placements, but I think that this way to play Magnezone right now with Skarmory is actually a little bit of a smarter decision in the current format than playing Darkrai EX, because Darkrai Magnezone, again, just has a really tough Exeggutor matchup. Even though it does do pretty well against this Skarmory version, you got to look at the overall meta landscape. But here is Darkrai Magnezone. This deck has been seeing a decent amount of decline. It still had a pretty good win rate this week, but the thing is here is that, again, we struggle against Exeggutor, and there's just not a lot of upside to playing this deck, at least in the format right now. However, what I did find to be a little bit interesting was that the average win rate for this deck really did kind of survive pretty highly. It still floated at a really average high win rate, and I think a big reason for that is because we do have a good Charizard matchup, we have a good Gyarados matchup, a good Palkia matchup. And those are decks, of course, that we're super effective against, and those are decks that people are oftentimes playing to counter Exeggutor. So this particular deck here, at least in the format right now, is sort of a counter pick. I know a lot of people have been talking about like a rock, paper, scissors sort of format here, but I don't think it's really that simple. We'll kind of go into that a little bit when we take a look at the matchups and the win rates and everything like that, and we look at the overall scope of the metagame. But here is Darkrai and Magnezone. Again, people playing Kangaskhan right now to be a little bit more proactive right off the jump. It's just good. You're able to donk executes if you're going first, one-hit KO them on the first turn, potentially doing 60 damage. I also think it's a little bit better to be proactive. There are still a decent amount of Druddigon decks running around, but also Rocky Helmet on Kangaskhan effectively kind of does the same thing. And like I said, we can afford to attach one energy to Kangaskhan because we don't necessarily need to have all of those energies on Darkrai by turn 3. It just isn't necessarily how the deck goes because on turn 4 we can just attach anyway, so that's 3 energy. So yeah, I think Kangaskhan is really good. It's also got 100 HP, so we're living sometimes 2 hits from Exeggutor. I think it's just a little bit more well positioned in the format right now. We're playing Cyrus, we're playing Sabrina, 1 Leaf as well. Again, if we're playing Kangaskhan, it might be smart to play Leaf as well. Darkrai retreat cost of 2, so I do like Leaf in the deck as well. But everything in here fairly standard. This deck has been somewhat the same for quite a while now. I do think it's a really good deck. I think that Magnezone in general is a really strong card, and Darkrai is good as well. So I like this list. However, like, it's not something I would have chosen to play, but enough people are still playing this deck. They still believe in it. And again, I do think it had a decent, I guess, in Swiss, right, in like the first day of tournament, there was a lot of decks that we did have a good matchup against, so its overall win rate was fairly high. But to that point, I think it did struggle once we got into top cut here. We did see it getting 3rd place, but there wasn't really any other Darkrai and Magnezone representation until all the way down to 16th place. And again, we do see one more Skarmory here at, 15th place, one at 18th, and then one again higher up here at 2nd place. So very interesting. Exeggutor did get 4th this week, so this is the other thing to mention, right, is that Exeggutor was by far the most played deck of this tournament, particularly the Celebi variant. I did put the Mew variant as my #1 choice going into this weekend. Not as many people played it, but it does have a significantly higher average win rate because, again, it kind of counters the counterplay to Exeggutor normally being Charizard, Gyarados, things like that. But a lot of Exeggutors kind of fell outside of that top 4 range. We see one here at 4th place, one at 6th, and then like 6 more making top 16. So I believe 8 Exeggutors made top 16, so still about a 50% representation in top 16, which is interesting. Let's take a look at the highest placing Celebi deck, and this is going to be super standard. Everything that we've seen over the last few weeks, in my mind, this is the best deck in the game right now. Again, we'll go back to that rock, paper, scissors thing that people were talking about, and yes, the format is always going to have a little bit of rock, paper, scissors, feel to it amongst the top decks. Of course, Exeggutor, strong against Darkrai and Magnezone, Charizard, good against Exeggutor, Darkrai, Magnezone, good against Charizard, but it doesn't really necessarily fall that way, because once you look outside of that top 3 deck interaction, Exeggutor just has a much better matchup spread against everything basically in the format that isn't Charizard or decks that are directly countering it. And that's why I think Exeggutor is really going to stay basically as the most played deck. You just can't really drop and play. If Exeggutor drops in play, then yes, Charizard becomes a little bit less impactful, but there's no reason not to be playing Exeggutor, mainly because it is by far the best overall deck in the format. It counters basically other tempo decks while also completely walling aggro decks, which are all really prominent in the format right now. It takes advantage of Cyrus, Sabrina, Pokemon Communications, and the tool cards better than almost any other deck in this format does. Grass type, again, still really good. People are still going to be playing Darkrai no matter what, right? People aren't always ahead of the curve from a metagame perspective, so people are always going to play Darkrai. It's like why people are still playing, Palkia and Gyarados, is because it's just the deck that they like to play. They know it's a strong deck. Even though it isn't maybe super well positioned in the metagame, they're still going to play it. So we're still going to see a lot of dark type decks, and we're still going to see a lot of, tempo water decks or even electro type decks that Exeggutor just does really good against. But it's fun to me, at least, that Skarmory is rising up. So I think that there is at least some rock, paper, scissors between, like Skarmory, the Skarmory Magnezone deck, Exeggutor, and Charizard, but I don't always think that it's like that. So we'll talk about that a little bit once we get past and we stop looking at the deck lists and we move into the win rates and stuff. But yeah, it's just interesting to note. But that is Exeggutor there getting 4th place. Let's take a look at the 7th place Gyarados list. And Gyarados is a really interesting one. So I haven't really talked about it much. It did win this first Earth Days tournament of this new Space-time Smackdown format. Nothing's really changed about Gyarados. In fact, we are just playing one Cyrus, which again, Cyrus is definitely really good with Greninja. We can tag a bench Pokemon to bring it up into the active spot, KO it with Gyarados. But for the most part, this is just typical Gyarados. It's still one of the strongest decks in the format. The thing with Gyarados is it's heavily countered by not only Magnezone in some ways, but but Hitmonlee in particular. And there's still a decent representation or amount of Hitmonlee in the format right now. It certainly hasn't risen to like maximum popularity. I don't know if it will, like in a world technically where like Exeggutor didn't already have a great matchup against those Darkrai decks. I do think that the Fighting Magnezone deck could see a lot of play. In fact, I talked about it pretty extensively last week. The thing with the Fighting Magnezone deck, and we're on a tangent now, it has good matchups against Charizard and Gyarados while also having a good matchup against Darkrai. It just struggles against Exeggutor, which is why I think some people shied away from it. There was still a lot of Exeggutor in this tournament. I don't think we really counterplayed Exeggutor enough. I don't think that, Skarmory and Magnezone is as good enough of a counter of Exeggutor, but again, I think people just didn't really want to play Charizard, so there wasn't as many people countering and playing Charizard. Even though Charizard did win the tournament, there really wasn't nearly enough of them in Top Cut. Still about 50% Exeggutor representation, which is pretty interesting as well. But yeah, here's Gyarados. So Gyarados is fine. It's got a good Exeggutor matchup, which I think is why it kind of carried its way into 7th place here, but it's really the only Gyarados list until the 23rd place. And if we go down, there's another one at 32nd. So Gyarados is still Gyarados. It has a good Exeggutor matchup. Once you get into day 2, if you're lucky enough to make it into day 2, it's very matchup dependent. It's single elimination, and it really depends on what your opponents are, right? You don't know. Like the odds are is that, you might just hit decks that you're really strong against, or you might hit decks that you're not very good against, and it really does kind of come down to a little bit more RNG based about, your matchups and what decks you're going up against. But Gyarados is still a really strong card. All the way down at 13th place is Mew and Exeggutor. So with the high amount of Gyarados and Charizard that people were playing this week, I did put this as my #1 pick. Again, when we take a look at the win rates and everything from the metagame, we'll see that this actually had a very high average win rate. But still, a lot of people not including Mew EX in their Exeggutor deck for a variety of different reasons. I think that it does make the deck a little bit less consistent overall and a little bit less good overall, but it does significantly help in those matchups. I think that if more people were playing Exeggutor and Mew EX, Charizard wouldn't have won this week. That's why I put it #1 on my list. But unfortunately, not everybody watches my videos, not everybody takes my advice. And I don't know everything, of course. But like I said, Charizard won this week, and I think a reason for that was most Exeggutor players weren't including Mew EX. If they did, they would have been able to counter maybe those Charizards a little bit more in Top Cut. But yeah, still a really strong deck. I don't know exactly like if people are ever really going to catch on to playing Mew EX. I think for the most part, people play like the core decks more than other variants, right? That's why when we'll take a look at the metagame, we'll see most people were playing Exeggutor with Celebi and no Mew EX, and not as many people were playing Yanmega or with Mew EX. That's just sort of how it goes in general, right? But if we go down a little bit and we go outside of top 16, there were actually some fighting decks and some really interesting decks that kind of found their way into Top Cut that weren't necessarily sort of meta contenders. And this is, something that I love to talk about and something that we're definitely going to touch on here. So the #1 deck in this category, at least I'll talk about, is at 20th place is actually going to be Gallade and Hitmonlee. So we've seen Gallade kind of knocking on the door a little bit. This was the deck here. It got 20th place in the tournament. I like Gallade, and I actually think that it's pretty good in the format right now. Do I think it's like a really top, contending deck? Not necessarily, but Hitmonlee is still really good in the Charizard matchup and in the Gyarados matchup. It's just good in general in the format right now, and people just don't necessarily know where or what to pair it with because it's not always super strong against Exeggutor. So pairing it with a card like Gallade, which actually does have a pretty decent Exeggutor matchup in the sense that like we're not doing a ton of damage with Gallade against Exeggutor, but we have a lot of HP, so we're not, getting KO'd. Rocky Helmet Gallade with Potion is going to be able to 2-hit KO Exeggutor, and that is pretty significant because on average we're doing more damage. So a Gallade that's fully set up, especially on a Hitmonlee with Cyrus, again, this combo is really good. Farfetch'd is a really strong leadoff, 40 damage as well. I really do like Gallade. I think that it's better than people give it credit for. It wasn't nearly played that much in this tournament, but I do think that as far as fighting decks go, things are pretty wide open. We'll also see that there was a Machamp deck that made pretty significant run here in this tournament. And again, I think that there just, again, wasn't a whole lot of fighting representation in this week's tournament. With so much Exeggutor, it's just tough. Like, those aggro fighting decks are really heavily walled by Exeggutor, which I think is why the fighting decks that made it into Top Cut or did pretty well were the these more late game, heavy hitting fighting decks, which is why we saw Machamp and Gallade, both very similar cards, but cards that do much better against Exeggutor than just playing like Hitmonlee with like, I don't know, like Aerodactyl or something like that. These are also fighting cards that are weak to Psychic and not Grass, so that is pretty significant as well. But here we go. So very similar list to the Gallade deck, right? Instead of playing, the Kirlia Ralts, Gallade, combination. Now we're just playing Machamp, Machoke, and Machop. Very similar. Like this deck is extremely similar to the Gallade deck, and again, it's more of a late game deck that actually does have pretty decent Exeggutor matchups. Like in theory, right? I mean, this is a really strong card. If we can kind of survive that early game and get the Machamp set up quick enough, then yeah, we just have enough HP and we're doing enough damage to kind of just roll over those Exeggutors and 2-hit KO them, especially combined with Rocky Helmet. Again, Hitmonlee Cyrus I like a lot. The Farfetch'd Hitmonchan Hitmonlee combination is interesting. He's kind of just throwing a bunch of leads in here. Hitmonlee's also in a tough spot because there are enough decks that don't have a lot of, like, there's not a lot of the decks in the format aren't running at a lot of Pokemon, which means that there's not a lot of bench Pokemon for us to attack. There is a decent amount of time where, in the first couple turns of the game, our opponent might not have any Pokemon on their bench, which makes Hitmonlee kind of fall out of favor a little bit, even though it is good against those Darkrai Magnezone decks, which do definitely have those bench Pokemon, whether it's Darkrai on the bench or Magnezone on the bench. If we're going against Exeggutor, odds are they're just not going to bench their Celebi or their second Execute, and there's nothing that Hitmonlee can do, and you're just going to get rolled by the Exeggutor. So it is interesting to note. The other downside, or at least a little bit more sketchy part about this deck, is that Exeggutor is running 2 Sabrinas, so an early Sabrina really could bring up this Machop and get KO'd, so it's not like a surefire great strategy against Exeggutor, but as far as fighting decks go, things like Machamp and Gallade have a much better Exeggutor matchup, as well as just a better matchup against, Darkrai decks like that, so in Magnezone decks as well, when KOing Magnezone. So I do think that these decks are good. They're good. I think that it was just more so a product of the current metagame and how things shaped up that we saw Gallade and Machamp make it into day 2 here, getting 20th and 22nd place respectfully, but I do really like fighting right now. It just wasn't a great time in the format to play fighting. Fighting definitely, does the best when it's more aggressive and things like that. Next, let's take a look at Pachirisu. And Pachirisu here, 18 trainer Pachirisu. I did kind of put this pretty high as well as my audible mentions for best picks. I think that these 18 trainer decks, whether it's Pachirisu or Articuno, is actually really, they're really interesting decks. I think they actually always have really high average win rates because they're just consistent. And I think tempo decks are pretty good in the format right now. And in general, I think that they're actually a lot better than people give it credit for. I don't think people are really going to ever play the 18 trainer decks like super prominently, but I do think that overall they're actually better than people give them credit for. And quickly, I want to take a look here at the Fighting Magnezone. So this was a deck here that, again, not many people played, but the thing with this deck is that it has really good matchups against all of the decks that aren't Exeggutor. Yes, like 25% of the tournament was playing Exeggutor, so that's probably why a lot of people shied away from playing this deck, but if enough people had played this archetype and it had found its way into Top Cut, I think that we could have actually seen this deck go really far, because again, we have good Charizard matchup, good Gyarados matchup, good Darkrai matchup, and there was a lot of those decks that went far in Top Cut because again, there wasn't enough counterplay to those counterplays. So sort of an anti-deck for that anti-meta deck in that particular sense, sort of a counterplay deck, but just didn't get enough representation. We didn't have anyone. There was one of these decks that made it into Top Cut, but other than that, pretty interesting. And then here is a Palkia deck. Again, not many people playing Palkia, but enough people playing Palkia that we did see it actually find its way into Top Cut as well. Just a really overall strong deck. There's so much Magnezone in the format that I don't understand why people would choose to play Palkia necessarily. Again, if you enjoy the deck, then you should play it, right? It's whatever you want to play, but as far as a meta pick perspective, I don't think that Palkia and Manaphy is a really strong choice, at least right now. But overall, I do like Palkia. I think it's one of the strongest decks in the game, just in a really bad spot from a meta perspective. But yeah, so that's kind of all of the top placing deck lists here, and that's really what the format looks like overall. I guess quickly, let's take a look at Magnezone, Yanmega EX and Exeggutor. And not many people play this. It's interesting because last week, this was actually the deck that won the Ursa Days tournament, but last week's Ursa Days tournament was heavily just dominated by Exeggutor in general. I think a lot of people understood that the Celebi version was just better in its own right. Even though Yanmega EX does somewhat have a favorable matchup against the Celebi version, it's just less good across the board and less consistent, especially in the early game, so a lot of people favoring Celebi, but I do like Yanmega. I think it's a really good card, and it is a little bit better, per se, maybe against Darkrai, guaranteeing that we get that KO, but we don't necessarily need like that extra like late game power when Exeggutor is just so consistent in its own right. And Celebi in a lot of scenarios is actually better, and it's better as an early Pokemon than Yanma, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's why not many people were playing Yanmega EX per se this week. But anyway, yeah, that was all of the highest placing deck lists of this particular tournament. Later this week, we'll take a look at all of the lists that aren't necessarily meta decks, but did end up doing well in this tournament. But next up, let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the metagame. And this was the overall sort of meta stats for the tournament here. What's interesting is that Exeggutor was, again, by far the most played deck of this week's tournament. We kind of knew that this would be the case, but we still see here 132 people playing Darkrai EX and Magnezone. This is interesting. This deck does not have a very good matchup against Exeggutor. Darkrai Greninja, not many people as well playing this deck, but about 80 people, so over 200 people actually if we also look at Weavile and Darkrai, and we add these numbers together. This is what, like 104? Or actually 114 plus 132. So Darkrai was the second most played deck of the tournament, which is interesting because, again, Exeggutor, we knew it was going to absolutely heavily dominate the tournament this week, and it's still, Darkrai still had a massive representation. Overall, Darkrai was the second most played deck in total. Almost like 400 people were playing Exeggutor in total here. If we look at 30, 35, and 339, literally, so about 400 plus people were playing Exeggutor this tournament. That's pretty, I kind of expected that. I'm not super surprised that many people were playing Exeggutor. And again, if we take a look here at playing the win, this was all of the decks that made it into day 2. We see a very high representation of Exeggutor here. So 40% share, 25 Exeggutor Celebi decks, but if we go down 5 Exeggutor Mew decks, and then 1 Exeggutor and Yanmega deck. One thing to note as well, so 5 Exeggutor and Mew EX made it into top cut. That is a 8% representation. But if you look at the overall metagame, here, it was only a 2% of the metagame representation. So definitely far and away very successful in this particular tournament. Also, just Celebi and Exeggutor, right? 21% or 20% meta share, but if we go into the top cut meta share, 40%. So basically, the percentage of Exeggutor decks that made it into top cut was much higher than the amount of Exeggutors that were in the tournament, just meaning that it was still a really good meta call, even though it was the best deck in the format, or it is at least right now the most played deck and the best deck in the format. Still a lot of people not counterplaying it at least highly enough here. Charizard, only 5 Charizard making it into top cut. That's a 7.8% representation. But if we take a look at the overall metagame, it was a 10% representation. So again, that's the thing with Charizard. Very low average win rate of 47%, but it always has a low win rate. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter because, again, all of those factors that we play into normally categorizing why a deck is good, Charizard really bypasses all of that because it's not about being average, like having an average high win rate, having a good matchup spread. It's just, you know, our highest potential is higher than every other deck. So out of 165 people playing Charizard, inevitably a couple of them are just going to draw really well. They're going to have really strong consecutive games where they draw well and they get lucky and they're just going to win because that's what Charizard does, is it high rolls and it wins. That's why it won this week's tournament. And again, not a lot of counterplay to Charizard, just in general. First of all, let's take a look at the matchup spreads for Exeggutor, and we'll see exactly what decks did well against Exeggutor this week. So Charizard, very, very good matchup against Exeggutor. About a 28% win rate against Charizard, Exeggutor has, which is very, very low. To be fair, very, very low. About a 56% win rate against Darkrai Magnezone. That's actually a little bit lower than it has been for previous weeks. And then a 46% against Magnezone and Skarmory. So these numbers here aren't super drastic, but Exeggutor does have a somewhat favorable matchup against Darkrai Magnezone, but a not so favorable matchup against Magnezone and Skarmory, which again, I think is why Skarmory is kind of on the rise. Still a really good matchup against Darkrai and Greninja, so this is a smaller sample size here, but I think it's probably why Darkrai and Greninja didn't necessarily do so well in this tournament. I think that overall this has a better, this deck is a little bit better overall than the Magnezone variant, which is why I've been kind of preaching playing Darkrai and Greninja, but it does struggle a lot more seemingly in the Exeggutor matchup, which again, not many people played counter to Exeggutor. They kind of stayed their footing and they just played Charizard if they were going to do that. Probably why Charizard won, but in general, not as much counterplay to Exeggutor this week, which is tough because there's not really a lot of decks that do counter Exeggutor, honestly. Exeggutor also struggles a little bit against Gyarados, but does well against basically everything else in the format, except Infernape as well has a pretty low win rate. So Exeggutor did have a super high average win rate of this tournament, about only 51%, but it doesn't really matter. Like when half of the format is counterplaying Exeggutor, for it to still have over a 50% win rate, really just kind of goes to show how strong the deck is here. But let's take a look here at the matchups for Charizard. And we'll see that the highest win rates here against Charizard were Exeggutor. Again, probably a big reason. In Top Cut, it really did farm a lot of those Exeggutors. Again, almost half of Top Cut was playing Exeggutor. Made room for those Charizard decks that did make it into Top Cut to have a really, nice sort of run through to make it into the finals there. Which, again, is kind of, exactly what happened. But it does struggle against, again, Magnezone Darkrai, Magnezone Skarmory. It struggles against Gyarados, and it struggles against the fighting, Magnezone deck as well. So not a really great matchup spread overall, really to any degree, but it does do really well against Exeggutor. So, Charizard's really weird. I don't know if we're going to see it dominate next week. Like I said, things will have to change. I think right now we're in a really weird spot where I think Exeggutor will decline and play a little bit. I think Charizard will see a little bit more play next week. So now we might have to try to counterplay Charizard while still keeping in mind Exeggutor, which is going to be very, very challenging in its own right. And then Darkrai Magnezone, which still remained at a pretty high win rate here, 53%. I think, again, we're just sort of farming all of these decks that don't have, that aren't Exeggutor, which is probably exactly what happened. So 43% against Exeggutor, but 70% against Charizard, 58% actually a really good win rate against the Magnezone Skarmory deck. So I think this probably did boost it pretty significantly in its win rates. Still a lot of Palkia play, and we actually lost somehow against Gyarados, but these sample sizes are pretty low, to be honest with you. I think really what we got to look at here is that we have a really good Charizard matchup, which is probably why the average Darkrai Magnezone win rate was pretty high, but realistically, it didn't really help it in the long run. At least that one player did get high ranked with Darkrai. But the highest rank was 13th, next was 16, and then everything down here was pretty low. So the placements in the results here of Darkrai Magnezone for being in top 3 played deck was actually considerably low. Like if you look at its like highest placements, but its overall win rate was high. So keep that in mind. Whereas like if we look at Charizard here, it got 1st, it got 5th, it got 10th, even though, so its placements were really good this week, but its average win rate was low. So these decks are kind of polar opposites right now. Very interesting to see sort of the dynamic between these two decks, right? A lot of people will think that Darkrai Magnezone is a better deck than Charizard, and in a lot of ways it is, but again, the standings and the placements really do speak for themselves. Magnezone and Skarmory, a really good pick. I think this deck is on the rise here. I think a lot of people should favor Magnezone Skarmory above Darkrai and Magnezone, but I think, again, people love Darkrai and a lot of people will still play it. They still believe in it, but it really hasn't done anything this format. Like, if we've taken a look at the last 3 Ursa Days tournaments, like, yes, a lot of people have played Darkrai Magnezone. It's had a good average win rate, especially early in the format when a lot of water decks were seeing play, but it hasn't won anything. It literally hasn't gotten first place at any of these Ursa Days tournaments. And I don't even know if it's really made top 4 that much as well. So it's kind of, you got to kind of keep that in mind if we're being entirely honest with you. But yeah, let's take a look here. So if we look at playing to win, these were the decks that made top cut. And again, it's somewhat interesting, but most of this is reflective of how many people were playing the decks, except for things like Charizard. So only 5 people playing Charizard made it into top 64. Keep that in mind. So literally, out of how many people playing Charizard in this tournament, very few of them made it into top cut, right? But that's what Charizard does. But if we take a look here, 73% win rate in top cut, 11-4, meaning that all of the Exeggutors that inevitably were going to make it into top cut got kind of just absolutely ran through by all of the Charizard players. And again, that's what we're playing Charizard for, is to counter those decks that we're going to be hitting in top cut. If we're lucky enough to make it into day 2, we're going to have a really high win rate against those particular decks that we're going to be going up against. Exeggutor by far the most common deck here, but you know, if we take a look at Felipe, and we take a look at his matchups, we'll see something really interesting here is that, yes, predominantly we played Exeggutor all tournament. So we didn't lose a single time. Or actually, we did. We lost 1 game against Exeggutor, but out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 out of our, how many matches is it? 16 matches? 10 out of our 16 matches were against Exeggutor, and we went 9-1. So there you go. That kind of says that Charizard was a smart pick of this tournament, but we did also beat Greninja Darkrai. We did also beat Palkia. We beat other Charizard decks, but then if we look at the last 2 standings, right? And this is what's crazy to me, is why how Charizard still ended up winning this tournament, was that in top 4, we beat Darkrai Magnezone, and then in the finals, we beat Darkrai and Skarmory, or Magnezone and Skarmory. So yes, like Exeggutor, we did kind of carry our way through all of the Exeggutors to make it far into the tournament, or Felipe did, but he ended up beating like 2 Magnezone decks, which is pretty hilarious to me, and just goes to show that Charizard is the high roll king. It's always a good pick, because it can happen like that. It can just happen like that, and people are never prepared for Charizard. It's hard to counterplay for it, to be honest with you. Like, there's nothing really that hard counters it other than like Hitmonlees and maybe Magnezone, but like, yeah, Charizard is just gonna always have the potential to win. It's just like that. That's just honestly how it goes. But if we go down here, let's filter by the win rate. So, or maybe not filter by the win rate, but let's filter by the Metashare, and we'll take a look at what really stands out from a win rate perspective. So again, Charizard pretty low, Darkrai, Greninja pretty low. I think that the way that the format turned out wasn't necessarily what I expected it to be, in the sense that people weren't necessarily hard countering Exeggutor that much. Most people just hopped on the Exeggutor train, but we still had a lot of people playing Magnezone, which is why Charizard ended up having a pretty average low win rate, and Garchomp, not Garchomp, Darkrai and Greninja, but they did end up still placing really, really well. Gyarados still a 52% win rate, which is kind of interesting to me. Palkia pretty low as well, just too much Magnezone for Palkia to be in this format right now. Still 50 people playing it, which to me is insane, but 45% win rate, definitely not super high. If we go down here, Exeggutor and Mew EX at a 57% win rate. That's higher than every other deck basically on this list until we go down to Yanmega and Dialga. So again, like I was saying, Exeggutor and Mew EX, way less people played it. Literally a tenth as many people played Exeggutor with Mew EX than without it. Again, if more people had played Mew EX in their Exeggutor decks, I don't know if Charizard would have ended up winning this tournament. It probably would have ended up being, you know, a Darkrai Magnezone deck or a Magnezone Skarmory deck. But yeah, just interesting to note, right, that not many people really played Mew EX, but it did have an extremely higher win rate because, again, we countered a lot of those Charizard decks that were also pretty prominently played. And if we go down to Yanmega and Dialga, this is something that, again, I want to take a look at. This isn't a large sample size, so only 16 people playing Dialga in this tournament, but not a single Dialga player made it into top cut. Dialga today had 0 representation in top 64. And if we look at the metagame here, it really wasn't highly played at all. 16 people playing Yanmega Dialga, 11 people playing Dialga and Melmetal. Yanmega had a much higher win rate, it always does. But yeah, 59, almost 60% win rate for Dialga and Yanmega, but the highest placing was only 108. So that's just a really great example, even though the sample size isn't really large, that a deck that has a super high average win rate isn't necessarily like the best choice. That doesn't mean that the deck is one of the best decks to play. Again, it's a small sample size, but like I said, if our average win rate here at 60% is like 5-3, or 6-4, like that's good, but that's not winning you any tournaments, right? Whereas a deck like Charizard that only had a 47% win rate got first place because, again, the average amount of Charizard players did not do extremely well, as we see from the standings, but there was that one player that went 14-2. That's what categorizes a deck to being strong. And if you're trying to win a tournament, it's not about playing the most consistent deck. Oftentimes, it's about playing the deck that either has the best matchup spread or the best our highest potential, right? And the strongest deck, which is Charizard. So yeah, that's the meta report for this week, guys. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Hopefully the timestamps, I'll put timestamps to make the deck or this video a little bit more easily navigatable. But yeah, we're kind of coming to the end of this format. There's not too much I guess to talk about from a deck perspective. These are just going to be more quicker updates as things go on over the next couple weeks. But one thing to keep in mind is that right now it's like the 17th, right? But the mini set A2A, A2A comes out in like 2 weeks. So we're actually going to be getting the mini set for Space-time Smackdown a lot earlier than we got Mythical Island. We're only getting like basically 4 weeks of this Space-time Smackdown format until the mini set comes out. So it's the 17th now. We really only have 2 more weeks until that mini set comes out. We should hear news about what that mini set is like next week, which is really, really interesting. And I'm really excited for that. Maybe even at the end of this week as well. But this particular format is going to be a lot shorter than I otherwise expect. But I'm really interested to see how things change as the weeks go on here. But anyway, we're going to wrap up the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Join the Discord. Link will be down in the description below. By the way, we're on the Limitless platform. That's what this website is. I know some people comment. The link for Limitless will be down in the description below. And if you want to play in these tournaments, I highly recommend it. Not just the Ursa Days tournament on the weekend, but there's tournaments every day that are really, really fun and interesting. And I think that it's definitely better when more people are competing. But anyway, guys, I'm going to get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. Tier List Tuesday tomorrow. And yeah, bye. Have a good one.